3 weeks before my wedding, my mom texted, "We'll be at Carter's gala instead. There'll be famous actors, even someone everyone knows." My dad added, "You understand." I did. Too well. While they chased handshakes and headlines, I married the love of my life in Santorini, and the celebrity they'd ditched me for walked into my ceremony instead. When the photos went viral, the truth didn't need defending. It just needed Wi-Fi. I'm Maddie Rowan, and this is how karma learned to trend. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The city outside my window was half asleep, the skyline breathing in soft gold and blue. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of my laptop, the glow of the screen washing over the dining table. I was editing the guest list one last time, half a glass of Chardonnay keeping me company. When the phone lit up beside me, I didn't even look at first. Then I saw it. Dad. I hesitated. For a moment, I thought about letting it ring out, but I didn't. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound normal. His voice came calm and businesslike, the same tone he used when talking to contractors. "Maddie, your mother and I wanted to let you know we won't be at your wedding." The air thinned. "Excuse me." Before I could say more, Mom's voice chimed in on speaker, bright, thrilled, completely out of sync with mine. "Sweetheart, it's the Collins Charity Gala next weekend. Everyone's going to be there. They say there'll be famous actors, even someone everyone knows. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." I stared at the cursor blinking on my laptop screen, the name Dad and Mom. Table 1, glowing in soft gray. "So," I said carefully, "a celebrity dinner is more important than your daughter's wedding." Mom hesitated for just a second, then launched into that tone she used when explaining away guilt. "Oh, honey, it's not like that. You know how rare these events are. We were invited through the Lewises. It's huge for your father's network." Dad cut in, his sigh heavy through the speaker. "You understand how these things work, Maddie. Connections matter." I laughed quietly, not out of humor, but disbelief. "Yeah," I said. "I guess they do." The silence that followed was dense enough to touch. Somewhere below my window, a siren wailed and faded. "Sweetheart," Mom added, her voice softening. "Don't make this into a big thing. We'll celebrate later, just us. You'll understand when you're older." "I'm 34, Mom," I said. "I think I'm old enough." There was a pause, then the call ended without goodbyes. I didn't even remember pressing end. The city lights outside flickered like they were blinking along with me. I sat there for a minute, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud. I picked up my glass, took one slow sip, and looked down at my laptop. The guest list was still open. My hand moved almost on its own. Highlight delete. Dad and Mom. Table 1 disappeared from the screen. My reflection hovered faintly on the glass. My hair was messy from the long day. My face looked older than it had that morning. I didn't cry. I just watched the cursor blink on the empty line, as if waiting for someone else to fill it. The apartment around me was perfectly still. The faint smell of wine and paper filled the air. For years I had imagined what it would feel like when I finally had something worth celebrating. I thought it would be full. People after family. But now it felt like a rehearsal in reverse. The room cleared before the show began. I closed the laptop and pushed it aside. My phone buzzed again. This time a message from Grace, my best friend and business partner. "Got your playlist for the ceremony. It's perfect. Don't stress tonight." I typed back, "Thanks," trying not to. I didn't mention the call. Some truths didn't deserve a stage. I stood stretched and walked toward the window. From the 23rd floor, the Chicago skyline looked almost peaceful. The river glowed faintly under the bridges, and tiny lights from office towers flickered like constellations trying to remember themselves. Voiceover. "I always thought love was unconditional. Turns out it came with an RSVP. I stayed by the window until my reflection blended into the dark glass, until I couldn't tell if I was looking out or in. I set my phone face down on the table, took a long breath, and let the silence settle in heavy but clean, like the moment before you start something new. When I think about my childhood, it's always summer in Lake Forest. The lawns were perfect, the houses all looked the same, and the air smelled like chlorine and money. My mom loved that neighborhood. "It's respectable," she used to say. Respectable was her favorite word. On my 10th birthday, she threw a joint party for me and Chloe in the backyard. 2 cakes sat on the picnic table, one white, one pink, but both had Chloe's name written in icing curls. "You girls can share," Mom said, beaming, as neighbors snapped pictures. It's more fun together. I remember watching Chloe blow out both sets of candles, cheeks, puffed hair bouncing like she was in a commercial. Everyone clapped. I kept smiling because that was the rule. Voiceover. I learned early that being quiet kept the peace. Later that night, when the house was dark, I crept downstairs and scraped my name off the leftover cake with a spoon. I didn't eat it. I just didn't want it sitting there pretending to be mine. Years slid by in that house like polished marble, smooth, cold, no grip. Chloe was the dancer, the sparkly one. I was the serious one. That was how people introduced us at church at dinner parties. I don't think anyone noticed that serious is just another word for alone. At 15, I spent most afternoons at the library, hiding between the tall shelves of nonfiction. The librarian would whisper, "You read like you're training for something." Maybe I was. I collected every honor certificate, every ribbon. They stacked up in a box under my bed, unphotographed, unseen. When graduation day came, I ironed my own gown and pinned my hair up the way Mom liked. The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and flowers. Rows of families filled the bleachers. I scanned the seats until my stomach turned. The row with reserved for parents stayed empty the whole ceremony. When my name was called, I walked across the stage anyway, chin high. The principal shook my hand. The photographer asked parents not here yet, I said. They're at my sister's recital. He hesitated, then offered, "Want me to take one for you anyway?" I smiled, but my throat ached. No, thank you. Outside, the air was thick with June humidity. People hugged cameras, flashed bouquets, rustled. I stood near the parking lot holding my diploma, the tassel brushing my arm. The wind flipped my program open to the back page. Ads from local businesses, congratulations to the class of 2009. None of them from my family. Voiceover. I promised myself one day they'd look for me in the crowd. At home that evening, the house smelled like dinner. Chloe's shoes were by the door, glittery and new. Mom was on the phone talking about the recital. It went beautifully, she said. The audience gave her a standing ovation. She didn't ask how my day went. I didn't tell her. After dinner, I went upstairs and sat at my desk. On top of my textbooks was an envelope with the University of Michigan crest. I'd been accepted with a partial scholarship. I should have been excited. Instead, I felt something heavier, a quiet relief that I could finally leave. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into my suitcase, along with a few clothes. A worn-out journal and the silver pen my English teacher gave me. From downstairs, laughter drifted up from the living room. Mom. Dad. Chloe. When the noise faded, I walked out into the hallway. The walls were lined with photos, Chloe's. Ballet recitals, family trips, Christmas cards. In every picture, Mom's hand rested on Chloe's shoulder. In the one photo of my science fair, Dad had his phone out, distracted mid-text. Everyone was smiling, but me. I touched the frame, then let my hand fall. In my room, the window was cracked open. A warm breeze carried in the smell of cut grass. My suitcase waited at my feet. I zipped it shut. When I opened the front door, the air outside was cooler. The streetlights flickered, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. I stood there for a moment, looking back through the open doorway. The family portrait over the fireplace glowed faintly in the lamplight. Then I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. Voiceover. That was the day I learned leaving isn't running away, it's reclaiming space. I carried my suitcase down the driveway, the wheels humming against the pavement. At the end of the street, a cab idled under the streetlight. The driver leaned out. "You Maddie?" "Yeah," I said, placing my bag in the trunk. As we pulled away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the dark trees. I turned my face toward the window, the night air pressing cool against the glass. In that reflection, I didn't look like the serious one anymore. I looked like someone starting over. Ann Arbor was colder than I'd imagined. The kind of cold that crawled through every seam in your coat, settled into your bones, and stayed. But the campus glowed at night. The library windows like lanterns against the snow, breath turning into small ghosts under the streetlights. I spent most evenings in the computer lab, a basement room that smelled like burnt coffee and old plastic. Grace Nolan sat beside me, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up. We'd met in an intro programming class, both too stubborn to quit when everyone else dropped out. "If this works," she said one night, squinting at her screen, "we might actually fix hospital supply chains. You realize that, right? I rubbed my eyes. Or at least prove two broke girls can make something that matters. She laughed, head tipping back. I'll take that. We lived on instant noodles and ambition. The janitor would come by at midnight, shake his head, and mutter, "You two don't ever sleep." Grace would grin. Sleep's for people who aren't building empires. No one clapped for us. But for the first time, I didn't need an audience. The code compiling without errors was applause enough. The project became our obsession, a small piece of software that tracked how hospitals stored and distributed medication. We named it MedAxis. It was basic, a skeleton of an idea, but it worked. Winter turned to spring. Snow melted into muddy sidewalks. I started to believe in the possibility of a life where I didn't have to chase anyone's approval. During one of our presentations, a professor pulled me aside. "You've got something real here," he said. "Keep going." That summer, Grace and I stayed in Ann Arbor to keep developing the program. We lived in a rented attic above a bookstore, the ceiling so low we had to duck in half the rooms. When the AC broke, we worked in our underwear coating with wet towels around our necks. We laughed until we couldn't breathe. Years began to blur. College ended and we took internships wherever we could, small startups, hospitals, anyone who'd give us a chance. There were failures. A pitch that bombed in San Francisco, a prototype that crashed in front of investors, a landlord who changed the locks when we were late on rent. We didn't quit. We just learned to keep moving. By 2016, we had a tiny office in San Diego, with 3 desks, 1 fan, and no windows. Grace decorated it with sticky notes that said things like, "Keep it alive and code like you mean it." I bought a coffee machine that hissed and sputtered but never quit, kind of like us. One morning, while we were arguing over budget spreadsheets, my phone buzzed. An email header flashed across the screen. "Congratulations." I opened it, scanning quickly. Our research paper, our little system that had started in that cold lab, had just won the National Innovation Award. My throat went dry. "Grace," I whispered, holding out my phone. "We did it." She blinked. "Wait, what?" Then she screamed the kind of sound that echoed off the walls and made the building manager yell at us. We danced between desks, laughing so hard I thought I might actually cry. After the noise died down, I called home. I wanted to hear their voices. For once, I wanted them to sound proud. The phone rang until voicemail kicked in. "Hey," I said. "It's me. I just wanted to tell you some good news. We won an award, national level. Our project MedAxis, remember?" Anyway, yeah. I hung up. 10 minutes later, a text came through. "Congrats. Busy weekend. Love you." They always had love, just never time. That night, I walked home along the harbor. The sun had already set, and the air smelled like salt and gasoline. Couples walked past holding hands. Music drifted from a restaurant across the street. I thought about all the moments I'd waited for my parents to show up, the empty seats, the half-listened calls. The difference now was I didn't need them there. The validation I'd been chasing all my life had quietly evaporated somewhere between the late-night coffees and the broken code. I stopped at the edge of the pier. The water shimmered under the streetlights, small waves brushing the dock. My breath clouded in the cool night air. I whispered, "You see that, Dad? I'm doing fine." There was no answer, of course, just the sound of the sea and the faint click of the harbor lights changing. I stood there until the wind grew sharp against my face. Then I turned and walked back toward the glow of the city, each step steadier than the last. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. By 2020, MedAxis was no longer just 2 girls coding in a basement. It was a name that appeared on conference screens on the sides of hospital walls, on badges clipped to doctors' coats. Every week, a new facility signed up to use our system. The software we once built out of caffeine and stubbornness was now running through the veins of American healthcare. The news called us 2 women reshaping the future of hospital logistics. CNBC ran a morning segment. Grace and I sat under the bright lights of the studio microphones, clipped to our blazers, pretending the whole thing didn't feel surreal. The interviewer smiled. "So how does it feel to be called the women who saved hospitals during a pandemic?" Grace laughed. "We just wrote code. The real heroes are the people who use it," I added. "We just tried to make their jobs a little easier." It was polished, professional, humble. Everything the press loved. Cameras flashed as we left the studio. Grace nudged me. "You realize we made it right?" "Maybe," I said. "Still feels like we're catching up to the idea." That night we celebrated at the office. Champagne popped, music played from someone's phone. Grace hugged me hard. You did it. I smiled. We did. The room was loud, full of people laughing, the sound bouncing off glass walls. I slipped away to the balcony, letting the noise fade behind me. Chicago stretched out beneath the night, lights glimmering like 1,000 promises. I took a breath, trying to believe it all. My phone buzzed. Dad. My stomach flipped, then settled into something like hope. I answered. Hey, Dad. I saw the article, he said. His tone was measured, polite. Impressive stuff. You've really done well for yourself. I smiled faintly. Thanks. It's been a crazy few years. He cleared his throat. Listen, I wanted to ask. You know Chloe's boyfriend, Carter Lewis. I've met him once, I think. His family's starting a new charity foundation. Big names, high exposure. Might be a great opportunity for you to get involved. Good publicity. I leaned against the railing. Publicity for what? For your company, your brand, whatever it is you do. You know, align yourself with the right people. It's all about optics. Optics. I laughed quietly. Dad. I build hospitals' lifelines, not photo ops. He chuckled like I was being dramatic, always so serious. Maybe that's why it works, I said. Anyway, he continued, the gala's next month. I'll send you the invite. I'll pass. He sighed. Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't try. The call ended. I stared at the city lights again, their reflection shimmering in the glass balcony door. The noise of the party drifted back into my awareness. Grace's laugh, the clinking of bottles, someone yelling for another toast. I whispered I thought success would fill the silence. It only made it echo louder. Over the next few years, MedAccess kept growing. Hospitals in New York, Miami, Dallas, all running on the system we'd built from scratch. Investors wanted in, so did the competition. Grace called it evolution. I called it exhaustion. We barely slept. Deals, board meetings, patent lawyers, non-stop travel. Every time the company climbed, another part of my life went quiet. Dating friends, family, background noise compared to the rhythm of deadlines. When the offer came from a major conglomerate in 2023, $92 million. Grace and I sat in a conference room overlooking the river. She stared at the papers. Are you ready to let it go? I nodded. We built it to work without us. That means we did our job. She signed. I signed. The room applauded politely, and just like that, a decade of my life fit into a few strokes of ink. That evening, I left the building alone. The city looked different. Bigger, somehow, colder. The streets below buzzed with traffic, neon lights, bleeding onto the wet pavement. People hurried past with coffees, briefcases, umbrellas, all of them looking like they were going somewhere. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I stopped at a corner store, bought a bottle of sparkling water, and wandered along the river. My reflection rippled in the dark water, broken every time a car passed overhead. When you finally win and there's no one clapping, that's when you understand what applause really means. I walked back to my apartment, heels clicking against the concrete, the sound echoing like a metronome counting time I'd never get back. Upstairs, I stood at the window again, the skyline spread before me. The same city, but quieter now, lonelier. The headlines would call me a success story, but standing there looking out at the endless lights, I realized success doesn't sound like a roar. It sounds like your own heartbeat in an empty room. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen counter, and listened to it echo in the stillness. Somewhere across town, Chloe was probably smiling. For cameras, my parents were laughing at another gala, and the world was moving without me. I thought of Grace's words after the interview. We made it. Maybe we had. But tonight, I wasn't sure what it even was. The San Diego Convention Center smelled like coffee and carpet glue. The kind of place where people measured worth by the weight of their lanyards. I'd just finished a keynote about data ethics and healthcare infrastructure. Dry to most, but the crowd had listened. Applause still echoed faintly as I stepped off stage, unclipping my mic and exhaling for the first time in an hour. That was incredible, a voice said behind me. Low, calm, unhurried. You made data sound poetic. I turned. A man in his mid-30s, dark hair, kind eyes, that didn't dart around the room like everyone else's. The tag on his blazer read Ethan Cole, Cypherworks Security. I laughed. That's a first. Usually people say I make it sound complicated. Complicated is fine, he said, smiling. It means you care about getting it right. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. Just ease. We ended up in the hotel lobby, 2 coffees between us, talking about everything except work. He asked about my childhood. I told him about Lake Forest, about a house that smelled like perfume and pressure. He told me he grew up in Oregon in a family that fixed cars for a living. I was supposed to inherit the garage, he said. Instead, I built firewalls. We laughed. He listened, not the polite waiting for his turn kind of listening, but the real kind, the kind that made you forget to guard yourself. Weeks passed. We ran into each other again at a fundraiser in La Jolla. He found me near the balcony, away from the noise. "Do you ever get tired of the small talk?" he asked. "All the time," I said, "but I'm good at pretending." He smiled. "You talk like someone who's seen every version of herself." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe I have." A few weeks later, he invited me hiking at Torrey Pines. The cliffs stretched out over the Pacific, the wind tearing through our words. We stopped halfway up, watching surfers dotting the waves below. "This place," I said, "feels like the edge of the world." He nodded. "You don't strike me as someone who likes edges. You like building things that last." "I don't know," I said. "I think I like rebuilding better." By the time we reached the top, I realized I hadn't thought about my parents once that day. That was new. Months passed in an easy blur. Quiet dinners in his downtown loft, weekends spent cooking badly, laughing harder. He'd hum old rock songs while washing dishes. I'd read research papers out loud, just to make him groan. With Ethan, silence finally meant peace, not punishment. One night in spring, we strung lights across his balcony. The air was soft, smelling faintly of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. We sat on the floor with a bottle of wine, legs touching the city, humming below us. He turned to me. "If we ever got married," he said casually, "where would you want it?" I smiled, tracing the rim of my glass. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere the sea feels like forgiveness." He thought for a moment. "Santorini." The word hung between us like a postcard. White villas, blue waterlight that didn't judge. I could almost hear the waves. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Santorini." We both laughed like it was a fantasy, but 2 months later he sent me a link to a real estate listing. A villa carved into the cliffside. White stone walls, arched windows, an infinity pool that spilled into the sky. "You're kidding," I said, scrolling through the photos. He shook his head. "It's been on the market for a while. 6.3 million. But the view," he whistled softly. "Worth it." I stared at the screen. "That's insane." "It's an investment," he said. In peace, a week later I was signing papers in a lawyer's office overlooking the bay. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When the final document was done, Ethan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, just realizing something. "What's that?" "That for the first time in my life, I'm buying something for me, not to prove anything to anyone." He smiled. "Good. Because you don't have to impress anyone anymore." That night we stood on the beach, watching the tide roll in. The moonlight turned the waves silver. I thought of my father's voice always telling me about connections, exposure, optics. Of my mother's laugh in crowded rooms. Of all the years I'd worked to be seen. Voiceover. It wasn't about money. It was about owning serenity. Ethan reached for my hand, and for once I didn't pull away. The ocean hissed softly against the sand. Somewhere in the dark, a gull cried out and vanished into the wind. The waves came in again and again like they were trying to erase everything that came before. 3 weeks before the wedding, my phone buzzed in the middle of a budget meeting. I glanced down, half expecting a message from Ethan or Grace. Instead, it was a group text titled Family. I hadn't seen a notification from that chat in months. "Lydia. We'll be at Carter's gala. The celebrity is confirmed." "You understand, right?" I stared at the screen. My thumb frozen. The room around me blurred. Grace was talking about a supplier contract. A projector hummed. Someone poured coffee, but it all felt far away. I typed slowly. "Of course, I understand." Then I hit send. It was strange how easy those words were to type. They didn't feel angry or cold, just final. That night, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the city outside. I sat on the windowsill, legs tucked beneath me, watching headlights move along the freeway. The skyline shimmered like a million little lies pretending to be stars. Ethan came in loosening his tie. "You've been quiet since dinner," he said. "Everything okay?" I didn't look up. "They're skipping the wedding. For a party." He stopped in the doorway, brow furrowed. "A party? A charity gala?" "Carter's hosting," I said, turning the phone toward him. "Apparently some big-name celebrity is attending. Mom said it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." He walked over and sat beside me, his hand brushing my knee. "You're serious?" I nodded. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Do you still want to go through with it?" I looked out the window again. The city lights reflected in the glass, little versions of us suspended between what was and what would be. "More than ever," I said, "because the people who'll be there won't need an invitation to care." He smiled softly like he understood something deeper than I'd said aloud. We sat there in silence for a while. The refrigerator clicked. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Ethan leaned his shoulder against mine, steady quiet. Later that night, I opened my laptop and pulled up the seating chart. Each name glowed faintly against the dark screen. I deleted Mom and Dad, table 1 again, even though I'd already done it weeks ago. This time, it didn't sting. It just felt like cleaning up. Voiceover. Sometimes the absence of love clears the room for the real kind. I printed the final list, stacked it neatly on the counter, and turned off the lights. The next morning, the sky over Lake Michigan was washed in pale gray. We packed our suitcases together, Ethan folding shirts with impossible precision, while I stuffed clothes like I was racing a clock. Our passports sat side by side on the counter, 2 small blue books ready for escape. "Do you have your charger?" he asked. "Yep, toothbrush." "Probably." He laughed. "That's not an answer." "I'll buy one there," I said. "They sell toothbrushes in Greece." He smiled, shaking his head. "You're impossible." At the airport, people rushed past us, voices overlapping in every direction. Someone's baby cried. An announcement echoed about a delayed flight. I held Ethan's hand as we moved through security. The smell of jet fuel and coffee filled the air. Familiar, sharp, full of promise. On the plane, I pressed my forehead against the window as Chicago disappeared beneath the clouds. The city looked small from up here, like something I could fold up and tuck away. Ethan leaned over. "What are you thinking?" "That I don't feel sad?" I said. "I should write, but I don't." He studied me for a moment. "Maybe that means you finally let them go." I nodded. "Maybe it does." Hours later, somewhere over the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers slept. The hum of the engines was steady like a heartbeat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I'd waited for my parents to show up, for birthdays, graduations, interviews, how every disappointment used to sting like proof that I wasn't enough. But somewhere between takeoff and sunrise, I realized something had shifted. Their absence no longer defined me. It just clarified the shape of my own life. Voiceover. Leaving Chicago felt less like running away and more like arriving, finally, somewhere honest. As the sun rose through the window, the light spilled across the cabin, warm and golden. Ethan stirred beside me, half awake, murmuring something about breakfast. I smiled, watching the glow stretch over his face. Below us, the ocean shimmered. A vast, endless expanse of blue. Somewhere across it waited the cliffs of Santorini. The villa carved into white stone, the ceremony I no longer needed anyone's permission to celebrate. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the plane drown out everything else. The morning air in Santorini felt like silk. Warm, clean, touched with salt. The villa clung to the cliffside like a pearl sunlight sliding across its white walls and cobalt domes. Below, the Aegean shimmered so bright it hurt to look at for too long. Staff moved quietly along the terrace, arranging chairs, candles, white roses that smelled faintly of honey. Somewhere inside, I could hear the hum of a violin warming up. I stepped outside barefoot, my veil brushing against my shoulder. The wind lifted the edge of my dress, cool against my skin. I looked around at the rows of empty chairs waiting to be filled, the ocean endless beyond them. I whispered to myself I didn't invite everyone I knew, just everyone who ever showed up. Grace arrived first, her husband trailing behind with a camera. She ran to hug me, eyes shining. "You did it, Maddie," she said. "This place, it's you. Peaceful and terrifyingly perfect." Rachel followed with her gear strapped over her shoulder. "You ready to go viral again?" she teased. I laughed. Let's skip the headlines this time. Then came Nora Bennett, moving slowly, a straw hat tilted to one side. She had been my mentor once, the kind of woman who'd lived 3 lives before 60. Her eyes were gentle but sharp. "Love doesn't need an audience, dear," she said, touching my arm. "It just needs presence." Her words lingered like the sea breeze. The ceremony began as the quartet started playing. The sound of strings rose and blended with the soft crash of waves below. Guests stood as I stepped onto the narrow stone path lined with olive branches. My dress caught the light, scattering it around me like dust. Ethan waited under an arch of white roses, his eyes steady and full. As I walked toward him, everything slowed. The air, the music, even the sound of my own heartbeat. Halfway down the path, I heard an unfamiliar sound, tires on gravel. A sleek, silver car pulled up near the villa gate. The staff just turned, whispering. Grace looked toward me with raised eyebrows, but I kept walking. The car door opened. Out stepped a woman, tall, graceful, wearing oversized sunglasses and a minimalist ivory dress that moved like water when she walked. Her presence shifted the air, subtle but undeniable. The guests turned in a quiet ripple of murmurs. I didn't need to ask who she was. Everyone knew her. The celebrity my parents had chosen over me. The face they had wanted to see instead of mine. For a moment, the irony was almost funny. The woman's manager hurried forward, lowering her voice. "She wanted to congratulate you personally," she said, glancing around as though the scene were too surreal to process. "She's admired your work with MedAxis for years." I blinked, a little stunned. "She knows me." "She read about your company during the pandemic," the manager said. "She said you changed how hospitals move supplies. She calls it elegant engineering." I smiled, not out of pride, but something softer. "Tell her she's welcome here," I said quietly. "Anyone who shows up is—" The woman removed her sunglasses as she approached. Her smile was calm, genuine, not the rehearsed kind people wear for cameras. "You're Maddie Rowan," she said. "I am," I answered. "I almost didn't make it," she said. But then I thought, what's the point of fame if you can't spend it on something real? Her words caught me off guard. "Thank you for coming," I said. "It means more than you think." She nodded, then took a seat at the back row, unbothered by the attention, as though she belonged there all along. The ceremony resumed. Ethan reached out his hand, grounding me back to the moment. His fingers were warm, familiar. We exchanged vows under the sunlight spilling gold across the sea. "I promise to be steady when life shakes you," he said, "and I promise not to run when it does." I replied, my voice steady but trembling inside. The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you partners in peace." Applause broke out, small but real. Grace wiped her eyes. Rachel caught the moment through her lens. The breeze lifting my veil, Ethan's laugh, the sea shining behind us. When it was over, the guests drifted toward the terrace for champagne and figs. I stayed a moment longer under the arch, watching the horizon. Voiceover. Sometimes karma doesn't roar. It arrives quietly, wearing designer heels. The celebrity lingered for a few minutes before leaving. As she walked past, she touched my arm lightly. "Beautiful ceremony," she said. "I hope they see the photos." "I'm sure they will," I said, smiling. "News travels fast these days." She laughed softly and disappeared into the car, her manager closing the door behind her. The sound of the engine faded into the hum of the ocean. I turned back toward the terrace, where laughter floated through the air. Ethan was pouring champagne, Grace waving me over. The sun hung low now, the light turning everything the color of honey. I joined them, raising my glass. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I couldn't name. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. The wind swept across the terrace, carrying the sound of waves and violin notes that drifted out into the open sky. The day ended in gold. The morning after the wedding smelled like salt and coffee. The villa was quieter now, the kind of quiet that hums with peace instead of absence. I sat on the terrace, bare feet, resting on the cool stone, watching the sun rise over the Aegean. Inside, Rachel was at the kitchen table, her laptop open, hair tied up in a messy knot. She was humming as she scrolled through the hundreds of photos she'd taken the day before. Grace's laughter, the reflection of sunlight on my veil, Ethan's hand steady against mine. The sound of the camera shutter had blended into the rhythm of the sea, but now it was the clicks of her keyboard that filled the air. "You're going to make us look too perfect," I called. She grinned without looking up. "Honey, perfection doesn't need editing, just good light and expensive wine." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're insufferable." "Flattered," she said. Then I heard the soft whoosh of a photo being uploaded. "There," she announced. "The world gets a glimpse." "What did you post, one shot?" she said. "The long table." Everyone laughing. Caption: "To those who showed up." I didn't think much of it then. We went about the morning. Coffee, croissants, sun lotion. By the time the tide started to rise, Rachel's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Maddie," she said, frowning at the screen. "You might want to see this." She turned the phone toward me. Hundreds of comments were flooding in. "Is that the actress?" She skipped the Collins gala for this "Wait, who's the bride?" "This looks way more real than those fake charity parties." I blinked. "No way." "Way," she said, scrolling faster. "It's blowing up, like majorly blowing up. By noon, we were on every social platform imaginable. American morning shows had already picked up the story. Somewhere across the ocean, anchors with practiced smiles were saying my name. A news clip reached us within hours, a voiceover from a popular entertainment segment. Sources confirm that the A-list actress canceled her appearance at the Collins Foundation Gala to attend a private wedding in Santorini, Greece. The screen split between two photos, one of me and Ethan kissing beneath a canopy of white roses, and one of Carter's empty gala ballroom in Chicago. Half the seats deserted, the celebrity's name still printed on a gold placard. Ethan came out onto the terrace, his coffee steaming in one hand. "Guess the world figured it out," he said, nodding toward the tablet on my lap. I took a sip of my drink. "I didn't need revenge," I said softly. "I just needed the truth to find its own audience." He smiled, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and kissed the top of my head. Then let them watch. We went about our day while the internet did its thing. Waves of curiosity, gossip, and awe. People dissected every frame, debating whether the celebrity's presence meant a statement against the Collins family, or just a coincidence. I didn't answer questions. Silence was the only statement I wanted to make. Meanwhile, in Chicago, my parents' phones were probably melting. I pictured my mother in her immaculate kitchen scrolling through headlines. She'd see the side-by-side photos, the glittering yet empty gala she'd attended, and the sunlit laughter she'd missed. I could almost hear her whisper, "That can't be true. She was supposed to be at the gala." I imagined my father sitting in his leather chair by the window, his jaw tight, his phone buzzing with calls he wouldn't answer. Thomas Rowan. A man who built his life on appearances, now watching the world celebrate the daughter he'd once deemed too serious. Lydia would have tried to spin it, of course. She always did. "It's just media exaggeration," she'd say, voice shaky. But the internet didn't care about explanations. It cared about contrast. The contrast was brutal. One image was mine, simple, golden, alive. The other was theirs, lavish, staged, hollow. They wanted a photo with fame. Instead, fame posed with integrity. That night, Rachel joined Ethan and me on the terrace again. She handed me her phone where the post had crossed 1,000,000 likes. "You realize this is insane, right?" she said. I glanced at the photo. The sunlight caught in the wine glasses, Grace mid-laugh, the blue ocean stretching behind us. I didn't look like someone who'd been left behind. I looked like someone finally seen by the right people. "I don't think it's insane," I said. "I think it's overdue." Rachel raised her glass. To overdo things? We clinked glasses and drank. The air tasted of salt and citrus, and for the first time in years I felt weightless. Back in Chicago, my mother's phone slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor with a crack, the screen freezing on a photo. Me smiling under the Santorini sun, the actress sitting quietly in the background, hands folded in her lap. The irony was too much to bear. I could almost hear the silence that followed, sharp and final. The next morning I woke to the sound of waves against the rocks. Ethan was already awake, reading the news on his tablet. "We're apparently trending," he said. "Of course we are. You want me to read the comments? God, no." He laughed, setting it aside. "Then let's go for a swim. Let them talk. We have better things to do." I smiled, stretching under the morning light. The air smelled like salt and new beginnings. As we walked down the steps toward the beach, I glanced back at the villa. Our villa, now the one built into the cliff, sunlight wrapping it in gold. For a moment I thought of my parents again, somewhere far away, watching the same sunrise, but missing its warmth completely. Maybe that was their real punishment. Sometimes karma doesn't roar. It just goes viral. 2 weeks after the wedding, the world had finally stopped talking about the Santorini photo. At least that's what I thought. Ethan and I were back in San Diego, the sun soft over the marina life, easing back into its old rhythm. But fame, or whatever version of it we'd stumbled into, has a way of echoing long after you think the noise has faded. One afternoon I was in the middle of a meeting at the MedAxis office when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me pause. Marcus Bell. He was an investigative journalist Ethan had introduced me to years ago. One of those reporters who sounded casual, but never called without purpose. I stepped into the hallway and answered, "Hey, Marcus, what's going on?" He didn't waste time. "You should know. There's an investigation. The Collins Foundation. The charity behind that gala your sister's boyfriend hosted." I frowned. "What kind of investigation? Financial? Missing funds, fake donations, falsified invoices? It's messy." His tone softened. "Maddie, your dad's name came up in the filings. For a second, the floor felt like it tilted. My father." He signed as a reference for the foundation's accounts. "There's a subpoena coming. I figured you'd rather hear it from me than from the news." I took a slow breath. "Thank you, Marcus." He hesitated. "You want to make a statement?" "No," I said. "I've said enough for one lifetime." I hung up and stared out the glass window, the Pacific glittering like nothing bad could ever happen under that kind of light. I didn't need to lift a finger. Karma had a calendar. By that evening, the story broke nationwide. News anchors with perfect smiles said words like embezzlement, tax fraud, and wire transfers disguised as donations. Cameras caught footage of police entering the Collins estate in Winnetka, Carter Lewis in his tailored suit being led to a car in handcuffs. And then, as the montage played, I saw it. Thomas Rowan's signature printed neatly on the donation records. My phone rang again. "Mom," I let it buzz twice before answering. Her voice was trembling. "Maddie, you have to understand, your father didn't know. He just signed a reference letter for Carter. Everyone does it." "Everyone," I asked quietly. She sniffed. "He thought it would help Chloe. The Collins family is important, and Mom." I cut in. You always knew what mattered most to him. Silence. Just her breath on the other end, quick and uneven. Then she whispered, "You sound just like your father when you're angry." "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm just done pretending." She didn't reply. The call ended a moment later, leaving only the hum of the dial tone. Meanwhile, the internet was eating the story alive. Talk shows ran segments comparing the integrity of the Santorini bride to the scandal of Chicago high society. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. Chloe called the next morning. Her voice was shaky, scared. "They froze his accounts, Maddie. Dad's furious, Mom won't stop crying, and Carter..." "What about Carter?" "He's ignoring my calls. His PR team told me to lay low." I hesitated. "You okay?" She let out a brittle laugh. I'm the punchline to a joke I didn't even know I was in. Later that day I saw footage online. Chloe confronting Carter outside a courthouse. She wore sunglasses and a trench coat looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "You used me for headlines," she said, her voice breaking. He smirked, pulling his arm free. "That's the business." The sound of her slap cracked through the video. She turned and walked away, leaving him blinking in the sunlight as cameras flashed. We were all learning what worth really meant. The week dragged on. Paparazzi started hanging outside my office building. I ignored them, kept working. Grace would slip in through the back door, shaking her head. "You're trending again. How does it feel to be America's moral compass?" "Exhausting," I said. "I'd rather just build something that works." One afternoon, I left the office to get some air. The sun was blinding off the glass towers downtown. As I reached the corner, a reporter stepped in front of me, microphone already out. "Ms. Rowan, did you invite the celebrity to your wedding as a form of revenge against your parents?" The question hung there sharp as a blade. I smiled softly. "No, I invited people who cared." Ethan pulled up just then, the car idling at the curb. I got in without looking back. As we drove away, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. I think I'm finally okay. Sometimes the loudest answer is no answer at all. We drove toward the ocean windows, downwind in our hair. Behind us, the city buzzed with noise and headlines. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and open blue as forgiveness. Rain slid down the windows in soft streaks, turning the Chicago skyline into a watercolor blur. I was back in my hotel room for a business trip, the kind where meetings blur into dinners and everyone pretends they're not exhausted. The city looked smaller now, less intimidating, like it had been stripped of its old power over me. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. Voicemail. The screen read, "Mom." I pressed play. "Maddie, please call us. We didn't mean to hurt you. We didn't want to be forgotten." Her voice cracked at the end, a sound I hadn't heard from her before. Uncertain, almost childlike. I stared at the phone for a long time. The rain kept tapping against the glass like it wanted to fill the silence. Then I opened my photo gallery, scrolled to a picture I'd taken a few days earlier. The sunrise over the Santorini cliffs, gold spilling across the sea. I sent it to her. No caption. Forgiveness isn't something you owe. It's something you outgrow. I set the phone face down and left it there, buzzing quietly against the wood. The next morning I stopped by a small cafe before my flight, the kind of place that smelled like rain-soaked pavement and roasted beans. I ordered a black coffee and sat near the window, watching the city wake up, people rushing by with umbrellas, buses hissing against puddles. A young woman at the counter kept glancing at me. Finally, she approached my table, nerves flickering behind her smile. "Sorry," she said. "Are you Maddie Rowan?" I nodded, surprised. "Yeah, I am." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. "I read your story. The one about your wedding and your parents and the celebrity thing. It kind of changed my life." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She looked down at her hands. "I was working for this awful PR firm. Everything was about pretending. Optics likes fake causes. I quit last week." "Wow," I said, genuinely impressed. "That's brave." I figured, she added, smiling shyly. "If you can choose peace over being liked, maybe I can too." I felt something in my chest loosen, the kind of quiet satisfaction that doesn't need applause. "Then it already did its job," I said. Her eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered, then hurried back to the counter. I sat there for a while after she left, watching steam curl off my coffee. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I thought about how many years I'd spent wanting to be seen by people who never looked, and how strangers somehow always found me anyway. That evening back home in San Diego, I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through headlines. "The Woman Who Chose Peace Over Fame" was the latest title making the rounds. They'd taken a photo of me from the wedding, smiling veil caught in the wind sunlight behind me. The image didn't look like revenge. It looked like release. I closed the laptop and turned off my phone. The world could talk without me for a while. Outside, the rain followed me home. I stepped into the backyard barefoot, the grass cool beneath my feet. The garden smelled of wet jasmine and rosemary. Drops clung to my hair and arms, small and cold, but the air felt good, alive, forgiving. For the first time, silence didn't ache. It healed. Ethan slid the patio door open and stepped out beside me. "You planning to stand out here all night?" he asked. Maybe I said, smiling. "Depends who's asking." He laughed, wrapping a towel around my shoulders. "You're impossible," consistently I replied. We sat together on the porch steps, watching the rain soften into mist. The garden lights flickered on, reflecting off the puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed faintly through the fog. Ethan leaned back, his arm brushing mine. "You ever miss it?" "What, the noise?" He nodded. "Not even a little," I said. He smiled. "Good." I rested my head on his shoulder. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the last drops sliding off the roof. The world was still talking about the scandal, the wedding, the meaning of peace, but I wasn't listening anymore. The quiet between us was its own kind of music, steady and real. We sat there until the lights inside the house dimmed and the garden shimmered under the silver sky. Both of us laughing softly about nothing at all. A year later, Santorini felt softer. The white walls of the villa had weathered into cream, the steps lined with wildflowers that had grown in the cracks between the stones. The air carried the same sea salt I remembered, but it smelled less like escape now and more like home. Laughter drifted from the terrace where Grace was helping set the table, her voice mingling with the clinking of glasses. The world had changed a dozen times since that day, but the sea whispered the same thing it always had. Peace never needs permission. I watched from the balcony as the afternoon light slid across the cliffs. The horizon shimmered in gold, and for a moment I could almost hear the echoes of that first wedding day. Violin notes in the breeze, the hush before vows. Ethan came up behind me, slipping an arm around my waist. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," I said. "Just thinking." He smiled. "That's usually dangerous." Before I could answer, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel below. When I turned, Chloe was standing at the gate. She looked nothing like the glossy girl from magazine spreads. Her hair was tied back, her dress plain cotton, no jewelry. Just Chloe, stripped of all the noise that used to orbit her. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I answered, walking toward her. She hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "I'm glad you did." Her eyes shone with tears. She tried to blink away. "I'm sorry, Maddie. He was never what I thought. None of it was." I reached for her hand. "Neither were they," I said quietly. "But maybe that's okay." She nodded, then pulled me into a hug. It was awkward at first, like remembering a language we'd both forgotten, but then it settled into something that felt natural again. For the first time in years, she didn't smell like perfume or spotlight, just salt and wind. We walked up the steps together. Grace greeted her with a glass of wine, Rachel snapped a candid photo, and Nora, sitting beneath an umbrella, smiled knowingly. "Sisters," she said, raising her glass. "Proof that time heals more than it breaks." As the evening deepened, the light softened to amber. The table stretched along the terrace, draped in linen candles, flickering against the breeze. Ethan poured wine. Laughter hummed like background music. It was a small gathering, family chosen, and otherwise. Then, near sunset, a car door shut in the distance. I looked up to see two figures walking slowly down the stone path. Thomas and Lydia. They looked smaller than I remembered. My father's shoulders no longer squared with authority. My mother's hair, once a meticulous blonde, had faded to silver near the roots. They carried nothing. No entourage. No gifts, just themselves. I didn't move at first. Neither did they. The air between us was heavy, but not bitter, just full of things unsaid. Mom was the first to step forward. She held a small bouquet of white lilies. "These are for the table," she said softly. I nodded. "They're beautiful." She placed them in the center, adjusting the stems until they stood straight. Then she sat. Dad followed quietly, taking the chair beside her. No one said the word sorry. It wasn't needed. We just sat listening to the sea below us, to the soft sound of plates and glasses, to the rhythm of breathing that filled the pauses. Nora broke the silence. "To showing up," she said, lifting her glass. I met her eyes, smiling. "To showing up." Everyone echoed it. Glasses clinked. For the first time in my life, my family and I occupied the same space without performing. No speeches, no pretense, no comparisons, just presence. My mother asked Grace about her kids. My father complimented Ethan's cooking. Chloe laughed at something Rachel said, her eyes lighter than I'd ever seen them. I looked around the table at faces glowing under the warm light, at the slow dance of candle flames in the wind. The ocean stretched endlessly behind us, the horizon fading into dusk. They finally came not to be seen, but to see. The sun sank lower, spilling gold across the table. It caught on the wine glasses on the curve of my mother's hand, on the white lilies, standing straight in their vase. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from sadness, but from something gentler, quieter. Gratitude, maybe. Or closure. Grace leaned toward me and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. I think this is what healing looks like." As the last light of day faded into blue, Nora's laughter floated through the air, deep and rich. Chloe reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from my face and smiled the kind of smile that said, "You made it through." The camera of memory drifted upward, framing it all. The family, the friends, the table bathed in gold. Laughter low and real. The moment felt suspended, untouched. A quiet mercy at the end of a long storm. The morning after the celebration was quiet enough to hear the sea breathing. The air was soft, carrying the scent of salt and warm stone. I walked barefoot along the narrow path that curved around the villa, the hem of my white linen dress brushing the dust from the steps. The Aegean stretched below me, calm and endless, the light breaking across it like a secret. I used to think revenge was the victory, but peace, that's the prize. The wind caught my hair as I stopped at the edge of the cliff looking down at the water. For a moment it felt like time folded in on itself. I could almost see all the versions of me standing there together. The child at the pink birthday table, the teenager alone at graduation, the woman in the apartment deleting her parents from the guest list. They all looked back at me smiling like they finally understood. Memories flickered like film reels, candles being blown out by someone else's breath. The empty seat marked reserved for parents, the blinking cursor over Dad and Mom, table 1. The gold light over Santorini as vows were spoken, the flashes of headlines that turned pain into spectacle. Each one faded into the waves below until only the present remained. The sea didn't erase anything. It just made the noise smaller. Behind me, footsteps. Ethan's voice was still rough from sleep. "You're up early." I turned. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling against the wind. He handed me one. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Best I have in years," I said and meant it. We sat on the low stone wall overlooking the cliffs, shoulders brushing. Seagulls wheeled above us, their wings slicing through the light. The horizon looked infinite, like the kind of quiet you could fall into forever. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The world didn't need words this morning. Finally, I said, "I don't need them to be sorry." Ethan glanced at me. "No." I shook my head. I just needed them to understand that love isn't attendance, it's presence. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "They showed up. That's something." "It is," I said softly. "And I'm not sure I would have appreciated that a few years ago. Back then, I wanted an apology that sounded like redemption. Now I just want peace that feels like truth." He smiled faintly. "You always had a way with words." I looked down at my reflection in the water far below. The dress, the sun, the faint shimmer of movement. They spent their lives chasing the spotlight, I said. But I found the sun. Ethan reached for my hand. His fingers were warm against mine, grounding. "You built something brighter than they ever could." I smiled, maybe, but I didn't build it alone. We sat there, the waves folding into themselves over and over, the light shifting from gold to white. Somewhere behind us, I could hear Grace's laughter drifting through the open doors of the villa, the clatter of dishes being cleared. Chloe's voice followed lighter, now unburdened. The sound felt like closure, not the dramatic kind, just the quiet sort that finally fits. For years, I thought healing would come with fireworks, that one perfect moment when everything made sense. Instead, it came like this slow, quiet, ordinary. Coffee cooling between my hands, the sea breathing below. Someone beside me who didn't need to fill the silence. Ethan squeezed my hand once more. "You ready to head back?" "Not yet." I said, "Let's stay a little longer." He nodded, resting his chin on my shoulder. Together, we watched the sunlight ripple over the water. I used to think being seen was proof that I mattered. Now I know it's the opposite. The most beautiful parts of life don't need an audience. And for the first time, I didn't need to be seen to be enough. The wind lifted again, carrying the smell of the sea through the air. The world below glowed as the day began. Boats cutting across the water, children laughing on a distant beach, the island alive, but unhurried. I leaned my head against Ethan's shoulder and closed my eyes. The stillness wasn't empty anymore. It was full of love, of forgiveness, of everything I thought I'd lost and somehow found again. The camera would have pulled back there, I think, catching the 2 of us framed against the horizon. The sound of the sea rising into soft piano notes. If you believe respect shouldn't be a privilege, but the bare minimum, we'll meet again in the next story. Because revenge stories aren't about hate. They're about becoming whole. See Cookie Preferences.